Okay, so I already know I blew my promise of not having an episode every week for the rest of the year, or having an episode every week for the rest of the year. I already blew that. I apologize. Last week was a bit chaotic for me, so that is why I didn't have an episode last week. But from here on out, there will be episodes every week for the rest of the year. Just saying. But before we jump into what I want to talk about today, I do want to throw something else, or I do want to talk about something else that popped up over the weekend. Or not, it didn't pop up, but one of my friends was talking to me on Snapchat, and she said she listened to the podcast. And I said, thank you. I really appreciate that. And what she said really got to me. She said, what you talk about in terms of mental health, talking about mental health, touched my soul. It was something to that effect. And I was like, yes, that's it. That's what I want me talking about mental health to do. I want it to touch people. I wanted to, I just, not necessarily just touch the soul, but just people to get a better understanding of what it's like to suffer with mental illness. That's basically what I'm trying to get across. And for people that go through things like anxiety and depression and things of that sort, basically what I'm doing is because it's easier to put into words. I'm hoping, by talking about it on the podcast here, and as I've continually said, that will be an underlying theme of this podcast, because mental health is important, and it's important to always keep a light shined on it. Never take our eyes off of it. Never, always keep a light on it. Because it's always going to be there. It's always important. Yes. And I also want to make something very clear here, that a lot of people don't understand when it comes to mental health. Not every day is not is not doom and gloom when you suffer with anxiety and depression and whatnot. It's not doom and gloom every day. At most days, just this is speaking from my experience, most days are not bad. Most days are pretty good. I'm pretty positive. I'm pretty upbeat. I feel good. But yes, there will be days where things just flare up, where I do get anxious, where I do get depressed. And we'll talk about it more here in just a second, because this weekend I kind of felt a little down. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But yes, every day is not doom and gloom when you have anxiety and depression. Some days will. Some days you'll have a flare-up and anxiety will pop out. It's what Jay Glazer, who I've talked about him on this podcast before, he wrote his book Unbreakable. He talks about living in the gray. Well, some days you will live in the gray. Some days will be bad. Some days you will not want to get out of bed. Some days you will be down. Some days you will be moody. That's not every single day, though. You know what I'm saying? It's not going to be every single day. Most days, like I said, most days for me are pretty good. But yes, there will be times where my anxiety flares up, where my depression will flare up, and where I will get moody and I will get down. It happens, especially when you suffer from anxiety and depression. But it's also not a walk in the park. It's really not. And I struggle with it. I continue to struggle with it, as I'm going to talk about here in a moment. This weekend I was a bit down, and I'm going to explain why. But I just wanted to start the show off this week by talking about what I received, the message I received from a friend who listened to this podcast over the weekend, and she told me, when I was talking about mental health, it touched her soul. Like, what I was saying about it touched her soul, and that made me feel incredibly, just incredibly good, because this is the whole point of this podcast. That's what I told her too. I said, this is the whole point of the podcast, is to get people to better understand not just what I go through, but what anybody who has anxiety, anybody who has depression, anybody who has mental illness of any kind goes through. I'm not talking for people that have like autism or ADHD or ADD, for that matter. I'm not talking about that per se. I'm talking just specifically anxiety and depression, because that's what I go through. There are tons of other podcasts that talk about that. I don't, but I'm going to go back to Jay Glazer for a second. He said, I was listening to he posts these little motivation podcasts. He talked about, in that one of the little motivation podcasts, he talked about taking the ego out of the fight, because mental health is really a struggle. It's a fight. And don't think about winning or losing battles. Mental health is a struggle. Mental health is a battle every day. You don't know when it's going to flare up. You don't know when it's going to pop up. Some days are good, some days are bad. But when you're dealing with mental health issues and mental illness, it's not a winning and losing battle. That's what he was trying to say, and I completely agree with that. It's not it's a struggle every day, but it's not a winning or losing battle every single, like, it's not a winning losing battle every single day, if you get what I'm saying. But he does have a podcast. It's called Unbreakable. Please go check it out. But he puts things into perspective more than I can, and it's just truly something. And also, one more thing before we get the podcast going, like what I want to talk about this week. I was thinking earlier last week, when I was not doing this podcast, because like I said, it was a bit chaotic. When I had a little bit of downtime, I was thinking about what I wanted to do with this podcast. I want to do a little mini series on social media, and let me explain. Like, I want to talk about social media in the sense of why it's so negative, why it is such a toxic cesspool of negativity, no matter where you go on social media. Facebook, Twitter. I know it's called X now, but I'm still calling it Twitter. I don't care. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Not so much Instagram, but mostly Facebook and Twitter. I want to talk about why it's such a toxic cesspool of not just misinformation, but negativity. And I want to talk about that. And I also want to talk about social media and how it has sort of ruined dating, and how it has made us even more lonely than maybe we even realized. And I want to also talk about ways that we can, help be a little more positive on social media, what we can post about more to kind of drown out the negativity that is strewn all across social media. Look for that series in the coming weeks, because that's something I want to talk about in full detail, because it's going to be at least a 3-part series, maybe even more, because I do want to talk about that. It's something that it's important. I think it needs to be talked about. Nobody else is really talking about it, so I will. And speaking of lonely, that's really the topic of today's podcast, which we're going to talk about right now. So, as I just said, loneliness is the topic of this week's podcast, and we already talked about it once in the podcast feed. I don't remember exactly the episode we talked about it. Okay, it was episode 6. I just did a little look through here. I just paused my recording and looked. It was episode 6. way back at the end of March, we talked about loneliness, but I want to return to it now because this past weekend, I was dealing with a great bit of loneliness, and um, it's unusual. It's been unusual for me specifically because I haven't really thought about it much recently. And I have a blog post coming out on my blog, um, which is easy to find. Literally, I can link the post in this podcast description so you can find it better. But, or just link the blog in general. But I do have a post coming up, coming out soon on my blog that talks about my struggles with loneliness and struggles with dating in general. And the social media series, when we talk about how dating and specifically feeling lonely has not been helped in any way because of social media. I want to talk about that in an upcoming episode of the social media series. But yeah, this weekend was particularly bad for me because it's the first time I really felt lonely in quite some time. And it's like I've said, it's unusual because I've been thinking about so many different things recently, about the podcast, about maybe trips I want to take next year and maybe even beyond, and things I want to do with my life. Because of course, this podcast is an important project of mine, but other things. So I hadn't even worried about dating in any way, shape, or form up until this past weekend. And I fear, and of course this is a genuine fear, with the holidays coming around the corner here real soon, in about a month or so, loneliness is going to ramp up, not just for me, but for many people, because they don't have a significant other to spend the holidays with. And sadly, holidays are a bad time of year when it comes to suicide. And suicide awareness, which of course ties in with mental health, is something I'm very passionate about. Having had suicidal thoughts myself and still have them occasionally to this day, I am very passionate about this, and I think the more awareness we can bring to it, the better. But yeah, the suicide is only going to ramp up, or suicide is only, the risk of it is only going to go up because of the holiday season, and people being lonely, and all that stuff. And it's something, like I said, it needs to be addressed and it needs to be talked about more. But today, as I'm recording this podcast, I'm recording it on a Monday. I'm feeling much better in terms of loneliness. I'm not feeling as lonely, but the night hasn't come yet. See, for me, and this is just me, the time that I get lonely is usually in the evenings, right around prime time, right around between about 8 and 10 o'clock is usually my prime time, so to speak, when it comes to being lonely. Now, what I do when I'm lonely is I get carried away sometimes. I go on all the dating apps, try to find somebody to talk to, but that's not what I should be doing. Basically, what I'm going to say to you right now is don't do what I do when I get lonely, okay? If you have friends, which all of us do, I'm sure, I know I do, and I don't talk to my friends as often as I should. And we just talked about Jay Glazer. I'm going to bring him back in for this because he says this perfectly. When you're struggling with mental health, and this is what his words, you text 4 friends, tell them you're struggling, but you also text 4 friends just to check in on them and see how they're doing. Well, I need to do that more. And that's what I'm going to be telling you to do. Text people and text your inner circle, text your team, so to speak, as Jay Glazer would say. text your team or text the people that are closest to you that really genuinely care about you, your closest friends, and tell them that, hey, I'm lonely, I'm struggling. I'm sure 9 times out of 10, they'll be there for you. Even 10 times out of 10, they'll be there for you. They'll listen to you. They'll listen to what you have to say. And then on the same token, text a couple other friends and say, hey, I just wanted to check on you to see how you were doing. Maybe friends that you haven't talked to in a while. I mean, I know I need to do that more. My buddy from California, him and I are trying to reconnect. We haven't talked in a real long time, but that's mostly because of life stuff getting in the way. He has a girlfriend. He has a job just like me. But we're trying to reconnect. We're trying to talk again, and we're getting there. He and I are getting there. We're getting back to talking again, and that's what I want, because we miss talking to each other. We miss our conversations. And if you've seen me long enough or followed me on social media long enough, you know him and I used to play video games together. I want to get back to that sometime. Hopefully we can. If not, it's no big deal. Honestly, I'd love to have him on the podcast, or maybe we'll just, have a conversation for the podcast or whatever. But I would love to just be able to talk with him again. And we're getting there. It's just taking a little bit of time. And it's understandable because of, again, like I said, we both have lives. He has a job. He has a girlfriend. I have a job. It's a whole thing. Life does get in the way, but the thing is, we can't let life get in the way too much. We need to reach out to those who maybe we haven't talked to in a while, and need to do that more often. But overall, it was a weekend that was filled with loneliness. I was a little down. I was not really depressed, but mostly just a little down, and bored. I was bored too, but that's every weekend. By the way, the Steelers won. I don't know how, but they won. I really don't know how, but they won because their offense sucks. But they do. I mean, come on, let's not kid ourselves here, okay? Let's not kid ourselves. The Steelers' offense is not good. But anyway, overall, I am getting better from where I was earlier this weekend, and I'm glad that I am, because we got important things to talk about here on the podcast and all that good stuff. And I know that made no sense, so I'm just going to segue right to the end of this thing. All right, and that being said, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really appreciate it. 5 stars. Please rate 5 stars on Spotify if you enjoyed what you heard, which some people do. I don't understand how, but thank you. Somebody did rate 5 stars on Spotify. I do appreciate that. And as always, please leave your comments, leave your feedback. I would love to hear what you have to say about the podcast. Like I said earlier, in this episode, I talked about a friend of mine who reached out to me saying that she was really touched by what I was talking about in terms of mental health. I want to hear more of that. I want to hear more comments. I want to hear what you guys have to say about what you're hearing here on the podcast. So please do let me know. Social media is the best way to do it. On Twitter and Instagram and Facebook as well. It's TJ Temple Media is the best way to do it there. If you don't have social media, it's totally fine. You can email TJTpodcast, PODCASTS @gmail.com. I'll see your comments. I'll see your emails. Or if you don't have email and you don't have social media, you can leave a voice message. And maybe down the line, if we get enough feedback and enough reaction and enough comments, we can do a feedback episode of this podcast, or even a Q&A. I would love to do that sometime down the road as well. That would be nice. So That'll do it for me this week. Thank you so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. And as always, I will see you next week.